Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this instalment, the Kingsmen have to face their destruction at the hands of the Golden Circle. The Kingsmen are nearly wiped out after a set of missile strikes at the hands of Poppy, played by Julianne Moore, who runs the secret Golden Circle that has claimed a monopoly on the drug trade. The only two left are Taron Egerton's Eggsy and Mark Strong's Merlin, who have to turn to their American cousins Statesman for help, including Pedro Pascal's whiskey, Channing Tatum's tequila, Halle Berry's ginger ale, and Jeff Bridges' champagne. But they also make a big discovery inside Statesman. Hart, played by Colin Firth, is back from the dead. One of 2015's biggest surprises for a lot of people was Kingsman: The Secret Service, which was brought to you by the team that made Kick-Ass, in that it was adapted from a Mark Millar graphic novel called The Secret Service that they then threw out of a window, and written by Jane Goldman and Matthew Vaughn, the latter also directing it. And it very much did what Kick-Ass did for the superhero movie to the spy film, and it was very much an affectionate, tongue-in-cheek, over-the-top pastiche of that genre. So it had all the elements of the sort of James Bond movie, of the gadgets and the sex, and it did it in a very cheeky, irreverent way, and it was very much in on the joke. It knew what it was, referencing and parodying, but at the same time, it also was quite sincere in a lot of ways, which undercut the potential smarminess of it, really. I think a lot of people had dismissed it before it came out as, oh, it's just chav James Bond, but then were really pleasantly surprised, especially because the action in that movie is some of the best that we've had in the past decade. I mean, you just have to ask anyone about Kingsman, and they'll probably bring up the church scene, because that is a virtuoso sequence. So now, 2 years later, we have the follow-up, The Golden Circle, and the question is, will they be able to match the first film? They're fully capable of doing it. We have the same writer, same director, all the cast returning, and of course we have this whole new set of characters who are representing the statesman. Surely with those ingredients we'd be able to get something that was up to the level of the Secret Service. Unfortunately, no. The Golden Circle is a mess. Not without its pleasures, but it is a mess. The Golden Circle opens with this big extended action sequence that takes up much of the first 10 minutes of the movie, and I don't just mean, oh, there's a little bit of preamble and then we get to the action. No, I mean from minute one, we are thrust right in the midst of it. It is full on, right from the outset. It's a sequence that loudly announces what this sequel is going to be, which is the same as the original, but bigger and more in your face. Quite literally, in fact, on that last part, because this action sequence is Eggsy fighting Charlie, who you might remember as the Kingsman candidate that was rejected in the first film, in the back of a moving taxicab. All the while they're being chased by other cars that are firing upon them at the same time. And it's this very invested, very CGI heavy set piece. All the while Matthew Vaughn is shooting this with the same sort of camera work that he brought to a number of sequences in Kingsman, in that the camera's got this very continuous movement, obviously all stitched together digitally, but even still, we're in this very claustrophobic environment and they're struggling against each other, almost pressed up against not just the inside walls of the cab, but also the inside walls of the frame itself, and it's very much this assault on your senses, not least because there's blaring music going on at the same time. And my first real thought while I was watching The Golden Circle was maybe one of too much, too big, too early. I didn't know what I was supposed to be invested in at this particular early point in the film. I mean, even though I liked the first film, I've only just been reintroduced to the main character, and I've also been reintroduced to another character that I barely remembered from the first one. It's sort of emblematic of the Golden Circle in that it's trying to do the bigger is better thing that a lot of sequels try to do, but it falls into the same trap of the usual follow-up while trying to make itself massive and, being a second helping of everything we loved about the first film. It misses that core crucial ingredient, which is to say its heart. It's not missing entirely from this outing. But really, I think the biggest problem with the Golden Circle is its indifference to its own structure. The best way of describing the actual story of the Golden Circle is trying to imagine Goldman and Vaughn having a pitch meeting where they just wrote down on a whiteboard every idea they had for the sequel, and then they just incorporated all of it into the script. They didn't throw any of them away. They're all in here somewhere, regardless of the execution, and then they just filmed it. It feels like this really sort of patchwork, episodic, all over the place structure, and it's a really huge problem for the film, because if you compare it to The Secret Service, that film had a very strong backbone in that we had this My Fair Lady / Pygmalion plot about the sort of rags to source of riches of Eggsy. He starts off as this street smart chav, and then he becomes civilized, but he sort of carries those abilities from his previous life into this new one as a secret agent, and he sort of becomes the best of both worlds. There's this real transformation, this arc that was very much the emotional centre of that first film. What I'm basically saying is that the first portion of the sequel is clearly missing Colin Firth. To be fair, that is somewhat understandable. One of my complaints about the previous film was that the final portion of the film, once Firth had exited the proceedings, there was a bit of a void created by his presence. Because of that, you desperately want Firth to arrive back on the scene, and he does 40 minutes into this movie, and the film has to go through these real contortions to bring this character back. Suffice to say, you're either on board with the explanation here or you aren't. It's really going to be a leap of faith for audiences. Without giving anything away, he's brought back through the power of science. Really preposterous science, but hey, it's a Kingsman movie, it's full of gadgets, you just gotta go with it, especially if you want to bring Colin Firth back. And I think the fact they did so is a sort of tacit acknowledgement that, yeah, if we were thinking of making this into a franchise, it was a mistake to kill him off. First casting, which is very much against type in a lot of ways. He is easily one of the best parts of both of these movies. It's not a paycheck appearance for him. He clearly commits to playing this character and where we've found him in this movie. I don't really want to give too much away about where the character is, because the advertising itself hasn't really told us too much about the return of Firth's character. But also, while the character of Harry is brought back, he's not quite back until later in the movie. The film still feels the need to sideline him further and then sideline him a bit more after that. And I found that a bit infuriating, because if you are going to bring this character back, stop putting barriers up. Use this character properly. Eventually, they do manage to get this character back to where he was in the first film. And at that point, we're allowed to actually see both Eggsy and Harry working together, which is a quite satisfying payoff if you've seen both films, because the original movie, one of the problems that I had is that we never actually saw them working together in the field. Now, I know the idea is that it was meant to replace him. At last, that promise is finally sort of, capitalised upon in this sequel. It's just that I just wish that it didn't take so much effort, because this whole stuff with Harry is another burden on the film that already has far too many weights on it. By far the biggest weight on this film's back is the sheer number of characters it has. The original Kingsman had this huge cast list, and many of them do return for this follow-up. The problem is, most of them aren't going to be sticking around for long unless their names are Mark Strong, Colin Firth, or Taron Egerton. And I think the cull that happens early on in this movie is an attempt to try and avoid this issue, because we've basically eradicated most of the supporting cast from the first film. But that's a bit of a problem in and of itself, because why bring these characters back in that case? Why bring a certain character back that I thought showed a lot of promise but wasn't used to her fullest potential in the first film, and then drop a bridge on them? Why do that? Nevertheless, that gives us a relatively clean slate to bring in the statesmen, who are meant to be the American counterparts of the Kingsmen, but instead the tailoring business, they're in alcohol. You think the movie is going to be the Kingsmen working along the statesmen side by side. It is, and it isn't. The marketing has very much prioritised Channing Tatum's tequila. He's barely even in the movie. It's basically an extended guest role. There's a real waste of having that actor in it. And the same goes for Jeff Bridges. You think that at some point he's going to do something cool or something outrageous. No, his entire role is behind a desk. Why cast these big name actors if you're not going to use them properly? It just ends up being distracting. In Channing Tatum's case, he spends the second half of the movie literally on ice. And it does feel like the reason that is that some characters, they wanted to do something and then they realised they didn't want to do it with that character, so they made another character. And that's only the impression that I got with Whiskey and Tequila, in that the two characters feel a bit interchangeable. And it's a real waste, because they establish a lot of things with these characters that they never really follow through on, because you have things like Tequila being set up as the statesman's counterpart to Eggsy, and you think that they're going to, sort of have this antagonistic relationship towards each other. No, that never really pays off into anything properly, fully fledged. You think that Mark Strong's Merlin is going to have this romantic relationship with Ginger because they spend so much time together in the movie, and it seems that there were hints that they might have filmed a couple of scenes where it leaned in that direction, but then the movie doesn't do that properly. It just feels like they could have just concentrated these characters and not spread them so thin, rather than having lots of different supporting players. Just have one or two, or maybe make the statesman feel more pivotal in what is supposed to be a movie relatively focused around them, and at least partially set in America. The one that actually gets the most screen time out of the statesman is Pedro Pascal. He is quite impressive in this movie. I wasn't really familiar with the actor beforehand, but he really sells in this role, because all the statesmen have this cowboy-like aesthetic. Pascal leans into that a lot, and he's really got a lot of charisma. You can understand why that they decided to focus on that character in particular. And again, I wish that they kind of exploited that a bit more, especially because he has quite a cool weapon. He likes to use a lasso, again, Western theme, but his version is a laser, so it can cut people in half. That is a really fun gimmick, and I would have thought the movie would have a little bit more fun with that idea, but again, it's one of those things, let's give him a laser lasso, let's only allow him to use it on a couple of occasions. Which brings us to the villain Poppy, played by Julianne Moore, who is having a whale of a time in this part, playing this smiling, personable, sadistic villain. It's clear they were aiming for something in the same ballpark as Valentine. I don't think it's better than that character for reasons that I'll get to, but as far as Moore herself goes, she's having so much fun. She's in these ruins that she's gaudily redecorated with 50s style Americana. So you've got this salon, the diner, and this theatre, and she's got robot dogs and giving people bionic arms. The fact that she's enjoying herself so much perhaps makes up for the fact that the villain's motivations and her actual scheme in general don't really hold up to a lot of scrutiny, to be perfectly frank. Her basic plot is that because she's taken over the drug empire of the entire world, she controls all of it. She holds the entire world to ransom because she has laced those drugs with a virus. And you just think to yourself, hang on a minute, so you're infecting your supply chain, aren't you effectively holding yourself to ransom? It doesn't really seem like the idea has been entirely thought through to a certain extent, and the movie tries to kind of pass that off as, she's psychotic. Well, that doesn't really cure all ills. So we have this plot going on, and this involves the president, played by Bruce Greenwood, and his advisor, Fox, played by Emily Watson. Again, these characters are really just introduced halfway into the movie all of a sudden, and it's clear Greenwood is meant to be this amalgamation of various kind of presidents. So obviously there's a lot of Trump in that performance, if I can say that, but there's also a fair bit of Bush, there's a bit of Reagan in there. It's clear it's meant to be this commentary on America's approach to the drug war, and that's one of the elements that does kind of work in this film, because there is actually a bit of edge to it. So you end up with this tug of war between two characters that have quite sinister agendas in their own way. I don't think the movie really helps its case by referencing the original and Valentine in that she's managed to use what happened in that film as a way of kidnapping Elton John for her own personal gain. And that's an idea that at first is really very funny, especially because Elton John is cursing up a storm and he's really game for it. But as the movie continues, and you realise that this isn't just a cameo, it's a full-on supporting role for Elton John, the gag does sort of wear thin after a while, especially because Elton John starts breaking the fourth wall towards the end of the movie, and you go, okay, I think you've overplayed your hand on this gag. And I know I spent a lot of time complaining about this movie, but I didn't hate it. There were things that I liked about it, and every so often I would be reminded of things about the original Kingsman that I did enjoy. The problem is that the movie kept reminding me that it wasn't matching up to the Secret Service because it kept playing back all the best moments of that movie. It again falls into another sequel trap of doing constant callbacks to itself. I get it. I remember those things about the first movie. That's why I'm seeing the sequel. I don't need to see reiterations or reminders of why I'm here in the first place. I don't need a callback to the pub scene in the first movie. I don't need to have full-on replays of the most memorable scenes from the first film. I remember them the first time around. And that becomes a bit of an issue because a lot of the movie feels like it's going, remember this? Remember this? I know! It was 2 years ago! It wasn't that long ago! It does feel a little bit self-congratulatory in that regard, but in those moments aside, the actual recurring elements do still work. Taron Egerton is still a massively likeable lead. This is the role that really made him a star overnight, and I think like Firth, he embodies a lot of the qualities that makes Kingsman a success with audiences, in that, yeah, he's a little bit cocky, he's a bit cheeky, but he's also got real heart. And while the movie doesn't really offer him that much to really play this time out, because there's no huge character arc here, he does get a little bit of one to play, in that he's trying to deal with this spy life, but he has to deal with the demands of it on his relationship because he's still continuing on with the princess, the Swedish princess, from the end of the first movie. Although her participation in this film feels more like, oh, we have to keep this character around because we got a bit of stick for the joke at the end of the first movie. But again, that's another character that just weighs down the movie, and I don't really know if I was really fully invested in that relationship, to be perfectly honest. And he has great chemistry with Mark Strong, who is ever reliable as always, and at this point is a Vaughan regular, having appeared in not just Kingsman, but also Kick-Ass and Stardust. And really, I think that the action sequences, they do deliver a lot of the time. I don't think they're quite as bloody or as kinetic as the first film, in spite of the fact that Vaughan does maybe overuse the single continuous take, and they do try and go bigger and grander in them, and they do still work. I do think that if you're going for this movie simply on having these outrageous action sequences that the first film delivered, you'll get a lot more of that. It is a shame, though, that the movie doesn't really have a proper calling card like the first film did. Yeah, it doesn't try to replicate the church sequence, which is probably a good thing, really, because, you know, an obvious attempt to try and copy that would have blatantly fell on its face. But even with that said, it's missing that big moment. Even the climax of the first film had the activation switch sequence, which was Meryl in of itself, and there's nothing like that. There's nothing as shockingly funny as that in this movie, unfortunately. There's a couple of times where they do try and go for something like that, but they don't quite get there, sadly. It's lacking that sort of surprise of the first film, or maybe it's just lacking that sort of invention of the first movie to really catalyse on that kind of moment. And I think that really kind of sums this up in that it brings back a lot of elements that made the first film work, and they still do here to an extent, but it's just missing that certain spark. I think that if you're a fan of the original movie, you'll like it. It really depends on your tolerance for the script and whether you can look past the fact that it's this big tangent-heavy hodgepodge of ideas that haven't quite been fully formed. If you just go into it expecting this big, cartoonish OTT spy romp, you'll probably have a good time with this in spite of your misgivings. I think this will be a quite polarising sequel in a lot of regards. It's just that we have seen this movie done before, and quite frankly, they did it perfectly well the first time around with Kingsman: The Secret Service. It just feels like this one is in a suit that's been very sloppily assembled and needs to be tied up just a little bit. It's lacking its manners. Kingsman: The Golden Circle does the typical sequel fumble in trying to do more of what you liked about the first, but ends up overstuffed and overindulgent. There's far too many characters and storylines fighting for attention that the film doesn't really anchor itself in the way that the original's Chav to Spy transformation did, and ends up wasting many members of its cast. The Statesmen in particular end up getting the short shrift, with Bridges and Tatum being sidelined for most of the film. That's not to say that the charm of the original doesn't surface, especially once Firth reappears despite a credibility-straying explanation, and Egerton is strong at good value, but it struggles to match it despite some kinetic action scenes, and the tone leans too broad, particularly Elton John's extended guest role. There's enough here to like if you're a fan of the first, but this Kingsman needs to learn some discipline. If you like this review, my Patreon is tailored for you, because you can see my reviews early among other perks, but until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.
Manners maketh a man.
Do you know what that means?